Welcome to the 57th episode of the Reading and Writing Podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Rutherford. Stay tuned for my interview with Peter Spiegelman, author of the mystery and thriller novels Thickest, Thieves, Red Cat, Death's Little Helpers, and Black Maps. Welcome back to the Reading and Writing Podcast. My guest today is Peter Spiegelman, thriller writer and author of the new book, Thickest, Thieves. In a recent blurb for the book, Lee Child wrote, "Slick, sophisticated, and satisfying. Thickest Thieves is thriller fiction at its best." Peter, welcome to the podcast.
Oh, thanks very much for having me.
Sure. Well, if someone listening hasn't heard about Thickest Thieves yet, can you describe your new novel for them?
Sure. The book is about a crew of highline thieves who specialize in stealing from other criminals and who are in the midst of the biggest, most complicated, and what they hope will be the last heist of their lives, the theft of $100 million from a Wall Street financier turned money launderer. And the book's protagonist is a guy named Carr, who's the crew's reluctant and untested boss, who was promoted to that role when his predecessor and mentor was killed in a job gone wrong. And Carr really has his hands full. He has to deal with the griping of his fractious crew, who don't have a lot of faith in him as a leader. And he's also come to suspect that his mentor's death was more than just an occupational hazard, but that he was set up maybe by somebody in the crew. So it's a heist story with a mystery, or even a couple of mysteries at its chewy center.
Great. Well, with Thickest Thieves, the setting ranges from South Florida to the Cayman Islands to Houston. And as you mentioned, it features many professional criminals. What kind of research did you do for Thickest Thieves?
Well, I worked on Wall Street for about 20 years.
That's some good research.
That's the easy joke, right? I actually did a fair amount of research, and I was sort of frightened by actually how much source material is readily available about cracking safes and picking locks and drilling lock sets and that sort of thing. It was actually kind of frightening as well as fascinating. So there was some research about the particular techniques and technologies that these guys might use. And then of course our recent history is sadly full of examples of financiers gone bad.
Sure. Well, I'm curious. I know a lot of writers hate the question, where do you get your ideas? But do you remember a specific moment or time where you kind of had the first glimmering of the idea for Thickest Thieves?
I don't remember a particular moment, but I remember sort of a period of time, and it was while I was in the midst of writing one of my series books, what would have been my fourth John March detective novel, and it was going badly. I have to say, it was just not turning out to be the book that I wanted it to be. It's one of those. I think it's always the case when you're a writer. There is your sort of platonic ideal of the book that you are going to write and that you're in the midst of writing, and then there's the reality on the page, and of course the two never quite mesh, and sometimes what you end up with is better in certain ways than what you imagine, and sometimes it's not quite what you imagine. But this was just not happening for me. Could not engage the story at all, and just felt like I could just never get to the heart of this thing. And as I was struggling with this and sort of getting nowhere, I just started having these ideas about a group of, kind of fractious, difficult, cranky thieves and their, sort of ambivalent and kind of untested boss, and the interplay between them as they try to pull off these jobs. So it really, I guess it sort of arose from the frustrations I was having with a book that wasn't quite gelling.
Interesting. You actually just answered my next question. I was going to ask you about the switch from John March, which was the private investigator featured in your first three books. You just mentioned, obviously, the struggle that you had with the fourth March novel. At this point, do you have other March novels planned, or are you working on another one? Should your readers expect to see him again?
I think that we will see John March again. I actually have a couple of different March books sketched out, but I think my next book will actually be a different book, not a March book, but it may be in fact the start of a different series. So March is, he's on hiatus for a little while, but not gone for good.
Not gone for good. That's great. Well, before you wrote your first novel, Black Maps, you worked in finance, as you mentioned earlier, and you ran a financial software company. During that period in your life, were you writing at the time, or were you thinking about writing?
I certainly was thinking about writing. I mean, I really have been thinking about writing and writing one sort of thing or another since I was a little kid. I really, started in grade school, where I wrote and drew very badly my own superhero comic book, and I'd staple them together with, and just had these stick figures leaping around. And I've always been interested in writing and storytelling. When I was an undergraduate, I was an English major. And my area of focus was 20th century poetry, and I was also a writer. I was writing poetry pretty seriously, and was sort of a hair's breadth from going into an MFA program. But then I kind of sobered up and realized I had to pay the rent. And so I embarked on a career that took me into software and into to Wall Street. But really throughout, writing was something I was interested in, and I've always written poetry. Black Maps was my first novel. Was the first piece of fiction that I had attempted, though I hadn't really tried any short stories or anything like that prior. So it was definitely a foray into a new world.
And what was that experience like for you? Obviously, as you just mentioned, you've had a long interest in writing, and possibly thought about doing an MFA program, but then did work in finance and software. What was the experience like when you finally sat down and started working on Black Maps?
Well, I started. I was actually still working and running this software company. And I was doing it, I was writing kind of on the weekends and holidays or on the plane back from wherever. So it was very much a part-time thing, but, my commute, my drive to work, I would sort of use that time to put together an outline, flesh out plot details, that sort of thing. And I guess initially I approached it, pretty much as a software guy would. I had a plan. I had an outline. I had a plan. I had a certain number of words. I wanted to write every day, and and this sort of thing. It was quite geeky, but it actually worked for me. So by the time I wrapped up at the software company, I probably had, I don't know, maybe 8 chapters, maybe 10 chapters, and then I was I was churning out a chapter and a half every week, pretty consistently. After that, when I started writing full time, and after a while, I had a book.
That's great. And after you finished writing Black Maps, what was the path to publication like for you? And I'll just add that your publisher is Knopf, and it just speaks to the level of your writing and talent that Knopf doesn't publish many what would be considered PI novels, not necessarily the John March novels are. But what was the path to publication like for you?
It was, I'm embarrassed to say it was pretty ridiculously easy. It was, I knew nothing about this industry at all before, I had finished my book. Really, when I was writing I wasn't thinking about what I would do with this manuscript after I was done. I just really wanted to finish, and finishing just felt like, such a great feeling of accomplishment. That, to a certain extent, everything that happened afterwards was gravy. So I had this manuscript, and I had inflicted it upon my friends and family, who were very complimentary and very encouraging. But I figured, okay, they're my friends and family. What are they going to say? And I went to my local library actually to a book event that they had. There was a reading by a guy who was a first-time author who had published a mystery novel after many, many years. His story was really sort of the typical story of endless rejection, and he was telling the story at the reading, and he told about finding an agent who was sort of interested in him but wanted a second opinion, and sent this manuscript out to a friend of his who had recently left a big New York publishing house and had just gone freelance, had become a freelance editor. But he respected this person's opinion, and if this person had good things to say about the book, then that was good enough for him to take it on. And as it turned out for this fellow, this editor liked it a lot, and he was on the road to publication. So I did a little detective work of my own and found out who this editor was. And, I sent her an email, and I'm sure she thought I was nuts at first. But she kindly agreed to take a look at 5 pages. And the next day, she sent me back an email asking for 5 more pages. And the next day, another email, another 5 pages. And then she asked for the whole manuscript. And a couple of days later, she got back to me and said, from an editorial perspective, there's not a lot I can tell you here. Your formatting is not exactly what the industry is looking for, but editorially, this is I think a very good manuscript, and so I can't really do a lot for you, but I do know a lot of agents, and I'd be happy to introduce you to some, and she kindly did. And there were a couple who were interested in representing me, and I met with them, and through that I met my agent, and who I've been very, very happy with, and through her good offices, I ended up with Knopf, and they've been wonderful to me. They're just a super, super bunch of people, and my editor is wonderful.
Great. Well, in addition to your novels, you've written short stories for several crime anthologies, and you edited the Wall Street Noir anthology. What was the editing process like for Wall Street Noir?
Oh, my gosh. It was both more rewarding and more difficult than I could ever have imagined. It really was... I'd never done anything like that before, and honestly had no idea what I was getting into and no idea what to expect. The authors who very generously agreed to participate were great. They were all great, and some of them were really great when it came to deadlines. Some of them were less great when it came to deadlines. And so there was a certain amount of chasing, with some people there was a certain amount of editing, and I had no idea how to approach that. I just knew, try to get on the same wavelength as the authors and say, okay, this is what is great about this story, and how can we make it more great? How can we get at more cleanly where this story seems to be going. That was, kind of the only approach I knew. And, and thankfully the folks I worked with were very amenable to that, super professional, when it came to, taking. So it really, a lot of work, but very rewarding at the end.
Great. Not to put you on the spot, since, obviously you enjoyed all of the writers that you asked to contribute, but are there a particular story or two from Wall Street Noir that just blew you away and that you would recommend?
Oh gosh, I'm really, it's like asking, who's your favorite kid. I'll tell you, I was surprised in a lot of ways. I had in mind, a kind of particular vision, of sort of what Wall Street Noir meant to me, what it said to me, and I guess my own story in there sort of speaks to that. And there were a number of other stories in there that I think were quite consistent with that. What surprised me, what I never anticipated. I got a couple of historical stories, which, from Jim Fusilli and from Megan Abbott. They wrote historical stories, which were, I just didn't expect that, and they were great. There was a tremendous amount of humor. Mark Haskell Smith wrote a story that still makes me laugh. And there was humor, albeit, quite black humor, shot through so many of the stories. Peter Blauner's story comes to mind as being, very funny, very knowing, kind of reinterpretation of The Godfather. I was particularly pleased to have a graphic story in there, which hadn't appeared in any of the Noir series books prior to that. So that was a lot of fun. So really hard to pick a favorite story, but I can tell you I was pleasantly surprised by so many of them. Just not, completely a different take than I would have had, but a really, very valid take on things.
Great. Well, when you worked in finance before you were a published writer, who are some of the thriller writers and noir writers that you were reading that kind of fired you up and made you want to write your own novels?
Oh gosh, from a very early age, I was reading this stuff. I mean, really from sort of like middle school on, and my first exposure to Dashiell Hammett and reading The Maltese Falcon really was a kind of a watershed experience for me. I was in middle school, and it was the first really sort of grown up book I remember reading. And I didn't get half of what was going on, at the time. But I knew that there was a lot here that I wasn't getting. But what I did get, I just, I thought was wonderful. The atmosphere, the sense of place just really came across. But, kind of the giants of crime fiction, Hammett and Chandler and Ross MacDonald, John D. MacDonald, Graham Greene, those guys. I'm also a big John le Carré fan. Alan First, who writes thrillers set during World War II. Right. A wonderful writer. Philip Kerr, I like a lot. Ward Just, who writes sort of political novels that sort of border on, that have elements of the thriller to them, but I think a lot of people would sort of categorize him as a literary novelist. I'm a huge fan of Daniel Woodrell, who wrote Tomato Red and Winter's Bone. Right. And it's just a wonderful writer. William Gibson, who's often thought of as a science fiction writer. Exactly. But there's really, certainly in his... Actually, I think in all of his works, there are, elements of the thriller that are kind of shot through all of those works. It's a long list. I could just go on and on.
Well, given that Thickest Thieves is now your fourth novel that you've had published, what advice do you have for aspiring writers and people who would like to have their own novels published?
Oh, gosh, I think focus less on, if you're new to this business, entirely, focus not at all on the business aspects of it at first. You've got to focus on your craft. You've got to write a lot, and first and foremost, you have to read a lot and figure out, what you like to read, what kinds of stories you respond to, and why. Because ultimately, those are the kind of stories that I think writers want to write. Ultimately, you're your own first reader, and so you want to craft a story that you want to read, right? And that takes a little thought, about understanding who you like to read and why. What is it that you're responding to? And then you just write a lot, and edit a lot, and don't be afraid to leave out a lot. I think one of the best pieces of advice I've ever gotten is that no one will ever miss all the great writing you leave out.
That's good advice. So what
great advice.
What are you working on now?
I'm working on a new book that may be part of the start of a new series. Don't want to say too much about it now, but it's very different setting for me. It's going to be set in Los Angeles, and as usual, we'll have plenty of atmosphere and very noirish overtones and themes.
Great. Well, again, we've been speaking with Peter Spiegelman, author of the new thriller novel Thickest, Thieves, which is available in bookstores now. Peter, thanks for doing the interview.
Thank you, Jeff. It was a pleasure.
Hi, this is author Peter Arulian, author of The Unremembered, and you're listening to the Reading and Writing Podcast.
Thanks for listening to my latest podcast. If you have a chance, please leave a review of the podcast in iTunes. It only takes a moment. Until next time, read some good books and be well.
Susan, it's so great to finally be able to get together again.
Oh, it sure is. And I really appreciate you picking up the bill.
I'm happy to. I've got the extra cash. Since we've all been driving so much more again, I've been using Get Upside, the free gas app that pays you cash back for every gallon of gas you buy.
Wait a minute. Are you saying you actually get paid cash when you buy gas with the Get Upside app?
Yes, up to 25 cents a gallon. Cash back every time I buy gas.
Does that actually add up to anything?
Some months I make $200 to $300.
Wow, that's serious extra cash. I'm downloading the free Get Upside app now.
Download the free Get Upside app now in the App Store or Google Play to save up to 25 cents a gallon when you buy gas. Use promo code PHIL for a 25 cents a gallon bonus on your first tank. That's up to 50 cents a gallon on your next fill-up. You can cash out anytime to PayPal or an e-gift card for Amazon and other brands. Just download the free Get Upside app and use promo code PHIL for a 25 cents a gallon bonus on your first tank. That's code PHIL.